Part 1. The Birth of a Promise. The son of David. The city of Jerusalem still carried the echo of King David's harp, his songs of victory, his cries of repentance, his prayers beneath the stars all were woven into the soul of Israel. But behind the songs of glory lay a story that began in pain and guilt, a story that would give birth to the child destined to become the wisest king the world had ever known. Bathsheba sat by the window of the royal chambers, her hands resting on her growing belly. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, falling softly across her face. She had known both shame and mercy. Once, she was the woman whose name had been whispered in judgment across the kingdom. Now, she was the woman carrying a promise of second chance, not just for herself, but for her husband, David. David had fallen far. The man after God's own heart had taken another man's wife, Sined, and the consequence of that sin was the death of their first child. David's heart had been shattered, his spirit crushed, but from his brokenness came repentance so deep that heaven itself seemed to weep with him. He wrote, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." And God, in his mercy, answered. When Solomon was born, it was not merely the birth of a prince, it was the birth of grace. The prophet Nathan came to David's house with a message from God. "You shall call his name Jedidiah, beloved of the Lord." Even before he could speak, Solomon's name was marked with divine affection. As a child, Solomon grew in the shadow of a giant. His father, David, was the warrior poet who had slain Goliath, conquered kingdoms, and written psalms that still stirred the hearts of men. But David's greatest lessons were not found in his victories. They were found in his failures. Solomon often watched his father pray. At dawn, when the city was still asleep, David would rise and pour out his soul before God. Sometimes in joy, sometimes in sorrow. Solomon learned that true kingship began not with a crown, but with a bowed head. He watched how his father treated his people with justice, but also with compassion. He saw the weight of leadership on David's shoulders, the burden of decisions that could shape the destiny of a nation. And he noticed how, in every battle and every judgment, David sought the will of God first. From his mother, Solomon learned something different: quiet strength. Bathsheba was no longer the broken woman of her past. She had been restored. Her love for David was patient, her heart tender but wise. She often told young Solomon, "Mercy is a king's greatest weapon." Years passed, and Solomon became thoughtful, observant, gentle in spirit. While his brothers fought for attention and power, Solomon remained still, listening. The servants whispered that there was something different about him, an air of calm that came not from pride, but from peace. David grew older, his once mighty hands trembling with age. Yet his eyes lit up whenever Solomon entered the room. He saw in his son the possibility of something greater than himself, a reign, not defined by conquest, but by understanding. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, David called Solomon to his side. The air was heavy with memory. David looked at the young man who would inherit his throne and said, "My son, I have shed much blood, but you will build what I could not, the house of the Lord." Those words planted a seed in Solomon's heart. A mission, a calling, a promise that his life would not just continue David's legacy, would fulfill it. But there was more. Beneath the surface of this royal destiny lay a divine lesson. Solomon's very existence was proof that God can turn shame into strength, sin into redemption, and brokenness into beauty. David's past could have disqualified him. Bathsheba's name could have remained a mark of disgrace, but instead, their union became the birthplace of wisdom, the foundation of a kingdom that would shine as a beacon of peace and prosperity. That night, Solomon stood on the palace balcony, gazing at the stars his father once sang to. He whispered a silent prayer, not for power, not for wealth, but for understanding. He did not yet know that this quiet yearning would one day bring God himself into his dreams. For now, he was just a young prince, the child of a story redeemed, learning from his father's repentance and his mother's grace. And heaven watched in silence, because from the ashes of David's sin, God was raising a king who would reveal a deeper truth, that even the wisest hearts are born from humility, and that before wisdom comes forgiveness. The Son of David had been born, and with him, the promise of divine wisdom. Part 2. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors of the royal palace. King David was old now, his strength fading, his once mighty voice trembling. The man who had faced Goliath now struggled to rise from his bed. Yet his mind was sharp, and his heart burned with one final duty: to secure the future of his kingdom. Outside those chambers, however, ambition stirred. Adonijah, David's eldest surviving son, saw his father's weakness as his opportunity. Handsome, proud, and born of royal blood, he believed the throne was rightfully his. Without waiting for David's blessing, he gathered his allies: Joab, the battle-hardened general, and Abiathar the priest, and whispered of a coronation. Trumpets sounded in secret corners of the city. A feast was prepared. Adonijah sat upon a seat of honor and declared himself king while his father still breathed. The streets buzzed with confusion. Was the old king dead? Was a new one crowned already? But in the palace, Bathsheba heard the rumors. Her heart raced. She remembered the promise, the word of the Lord spoken through the prophet Nathan, that Solomon, her son, would sit upon David's throne. This was not ambition. This was destiny. And destiny was being challenged. Without hesitation, she went to David's chamber. Her steps quick, her voice steady. "My lord," she said softly, kneeling beside the aging king, "you swore by the Lord your God that Solomon would reign after you. But Adonijah has declared himself king unto you, my lord. Do not know it." The prophet Nathan entered soon after, confirming her words. His eyes carried both urgency and faith. "My king," he said, "the time has come to fulfill what God has spoken. Name your son Solomon before all Israel." David's frail hand clenched the arm of his chair. The years of battle had left him weary, but not broken. With one last surge of royal resolve, he gave the command: "Take Solomon, my son, set him on my own mule. Bring him to Gihon. There Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet shall anoint him king over Israel." The moment was electric. As Solomon rode through the streets, surrounded by the sound of shofars and the voices of the people shouting, "Long live King Solomon," the city that had been torn by whispers now erupted in joy. Even Adonijah's feast fell silent when the echo reached his ears. His stolen crown had vanished before it even settled on his head. Back in the palace, David smiled. His heart found peace at last. He called for Solomon and, with trembling hands, placed his blessing upon him. "My son," David said, his voice soft but filled with power, "be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walk in his ways. Keep his statutes and his commandments, so that you may prosper in all that you do." Tears filled Solomon's eyes. This was not just the command of a father, it was the passing of a sacred trust. He understood the weight of it. He had seen the cost of disobedience in his father's life, and now the mantle of responsibility was his to bear. When David died, the kingdom mourned for 40 days. The shepherd king was gone, and the young Solomon, barely in his 20s, stood alone before the nation. The crown felt heavy upon his head, heavier than he had imagined. Around him stood counselors, warriors, priests, and enemies. The new king faced his first test, not on the battlefield, but in the court of justice. Adonijah, now humbled, came pleading for mercy. He bowed low and said, "Let King Solomon swear that he will not put his servant to death." Solomon looked at him long, weighing every word. He was young, but his heart was already learning to balance justice with mercy. "If he proves himself a worthy man," Solomon said calmly, "not a hair of his head shall fall to the ground. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die." The people whispered among themselves. This was not the rashness of youth, it was discernment, the kind of wisdom that watches, waits, and judges with patience. But peace is a fragile crown. Not long after, Adonijah's pride rose again. He sought to marry Abishag, the woman who had attended King David in his final days. A request that carried more than romance. An ancient custom, to take the concubine of a king was to claim his throne. When word reached Solomon, his eyes darkened. The mercy he had shown was now betrayed. "You have spoken this word against your own life," he said, and wheat that the sentence was carried out. It was a harsh decision, but one born of necessity. The young king understood something few men his age ever do, that peace often requires strength, and that mercy must walk hand in hand with justice. In those early years, Solomon's reign was tested by whispers of rebellion, hidden loyalties, and uncertain hearts. Yet each challenge forged his character, polishing the soul that God was preparing for greatness. At night he would walk through the quiet halls of the palace, remembering his father's words. "Be strong and walk in God's ways." Sometimes he would pause before the Ark of the Covenant, kneeling in silence. He did not ask for glory or victory, only for understanding. For Solomon knew that a king who ruled by fear would one day fall, but a king who ruled by wisdom could lead a nation into peace. And though the throne of Israel was now his, he understood something profound. The true kingship begins not with power, but with courage guided by the will of God. The first test had come. The throne was his, but heaven was not done shaping him yet. Bekase soan. In a dream that would change everything, God himself would ask Solomon a question no man had ever been asked before. Part 3. The kingdom of Israel was quiet that night. The moon hung high above the hills, its pale light spilling over the rooftops of Jerusalem. In the palace, King Solomon sat alone, his crown resting on the table beside him. He stared at it for a long while, this golden circle that glittered in the lamplight, heavy not only with gold, but with the weight of destiny. It was young, wise beyond his years, but even the wisest grow weary when faced with the burden of leading a nation chosen by God himself. The throne was his, yet his heart was restless. He knew the people looked to him for judgment, for guidance, for strength, and deep within, Solomon feared one thing, that he might fail where his father had once stumbled. So he decided to seek the Lord. At Gibeon, the most sacred high place in Israel, stood an ancient altar built for sacrifice. It was there Solomon gathered his servants and priests, and together they offered 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord. The flames crackled against the night sky, sending smoke spiraling upward like prayers rising to heaven. The air shimmered with heat and holiness, and when the people finally slept, Solomon lay down under the stars, the scent of burning incense still in the air. His eyes closed, and suddenly he was no longer on the earth. He was standing in light. The silence around him was vast and living, and from the light came a voice gentle, yet full of power. It was the voice that had spoken to Moses from the burning bush, that had called Samuel in the night, that had walked with David in battle. "Solomon," said the voice of God, "ask what I shall give you." The words hung in the air like a promise beyond imagination. Solomon could have asked for anything: long life, victory over his enemies, endless riches, fame that would echo through the ages. Every desire of man was within his reach. But in that sacred moment, the young king's heart spoke truth. "My lord," Solomon answered, his voice trembling with reverence, "you have shown great mercy to my father, David, and have made me king in his place. But I am only a little child. do not know how to go out or come in. I stand among your people, a great nation too numerous to count. Therefore, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge so great a people? He did not ask for power, he did not ask for wealth. He asked for wisdom, the kind that sees beyond appearances, that hears truth in silence, that knows right from wrong even when the world cannot. There was a pause, as if heaven itself was listening, and then God's voice broke through the light again, filled with delight, because you have asked for this thing, and not for long life or riches for yourself, nor for the death of your enemies, but have asked for understanding to discern just. I have done according to your words. I have given you a wise and understanding heart, such as none before you has had, nor shall any arise after you. And I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like you all your days. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my commandments, as your father David did, I will lengthen your days. The words wrapped around Solomon like fire and light. He felt something stir deep within, a divine clarity, a sudden awakening of the mind. Thoughts he had never known flowed like rivers through his soul. He understood things beyond learning, beyond reason. It was as though the wisdom of heaven itself had taken root in his heart. When they awoke, the sun was rising over Gibeon. The morning breeze was cool and sweet. Solomon stood, trembling slightly, for he knew that what had happened was not a dream, it was a covenant. He returned to Jerusalem with new eyes. His steps were steady, his gaze serene. The people saw a change in him. There was a calmness, a quiet authority that seemed to command respect without demand. He went before the Ark of the Covenant and offered sacrifices of peace offerings. The musicians played, the priests sang, and the air was filled with joy. But within Solomon, something deeper was happening. He began to see the world differently. Every judgment, every face, every decision seemed woven into a greater design. He could sense deceit and flattery, truth and silence, and the subtle workings of the human heart. Servants whispered, "The Lord has touched him." And they were right. But wisdom was not meant to rest, it was meant to be tested. And soon, Solomon's newfound gift would be put on display in a moment that would define him forever. For now, though, he stood on the balcony of his palace, watching the people below, the children laughing in the streets, the traders shouting in the marketplace, the elders sitting in council. He whispered a prayer. "O Lord, give me strength to use this gift for your glory. Let me see as you see, judge as you judge, love as you love." The wind carried his words into the horizon, over the hills of Judah, over the Temple Mount that he would one day build, and in the heavens, God smiled, because Solomon had not asked for power to rule, but for the wisdom to serve. And in that humility, he became the vessel through which divine wisdom would flow into the world. The throne was now more than a seat of kings, it was a mirror of heaven's heart. Part 4. The morning sun poured through the open windows of the royal court. The sound of sandals echoed on the marble floor as men and women lined up with petitions, disputes, and questions for the young king whose wisdom had already become legend. But on that particular day, 2 women approached, both weeping, both desperate, holding on to the same plea. They were brought before King Solomon, their faces tired and tear-streaked. One carried a small blanket in her hands. The other clutched her chest as though her heart might break at any moment. The court fell silent. "My lord," the first woman said, bowing low, "we live in the same house. I gave birth to a son, and 3 days later, this woman also gave birth. We were alone, there was no one else with us. But during the night, her child died. She arose while I slept, took my son from beside me, and laid her dead child in my arms." The second woman shook her head violently. "No, the living child is mine. and the dead one is hers. The first woman cried out, "It is not true, my lord. The dead child is hers. The living one is mine." The voices clashed like thunder, pain and accusation twisting through the air. No witness could confirm the truth. No evidence could prove who was right. The court murmured. Even the advisors were unsure. But Solomon sat still, his eyes fixed on the two women, his hands folded. Tanna spoke softly at first. "Bring me a sword." A ripple of shock spread through the room. A guard hesitated but obeyed, handing the gleaming blade to the king. Solomon rose from his throne, the sword in his hand, catching the light like fire. "Divide the living child in two," he said, his voice calm, almost cold. "Give half to one woman and half to the other." A gasp filled the chamber. The first woman's face went pale, her knees trembling. But the second woman, the true mother, cried out and fell to the floor. "No, my lord. Please, give her the child. Do not kill him." Her words broke through the silence like a storm breaking over still waters. And Solomon lowered the sword. His eyes softened. "Do not kill the child," he sighed faintly. "Give the baby to her, the first woman. She is his mother." The court erupted in awe. The guards stood motionless, their faces struck with wonder. The two women were led out, one weeping in joy, the other in Shemond. The story spread through the streets like wildfire. All Israel heard of the judgment the king had rendered, and they feared him, for they saw that the wisdom of God was within him to do justice. But beyond the miracle of discernment lay something deeper, a glimpse into the very nature of wisdom. Solomon had not merely uncovered truth. He had revealed the power of compassion. For true wisdom, he now understood, was not found in cleverness or intellect. It was found in understanding the heart. That night, Solomon sat alone again, the city quiet beneath a canopy of stars. The events of the day echoed in his mind, the cries of the mothers, the moment of truth, the weight of decision. He realized that wisdom was not simply knowing what was right. It was feeling what was right. He opened a scroll and began to write. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." Those words would one day become scripture. But for now, they were the quiet reflection of a king whose heart had begun to understand the divine pattern behind human pain. He looked out at the horizon and saw torches flickering across the hills, homes of farmers, merchants, shepherds, families all, depending on his judgment, all trusting him to see clearly when they could not. And he whispered to himself, "Wisdom without compassion is nothing but stone." Days turned to weeks, and the young king's fame began to spread far beyond Israel. Merchants carried his story to Egypt, to Tyre, to Babylon. Poets sang of the king who could read men's hearts. Foreign envoys came to hear him speak, astonished by his clarity and grace. But Solomon was not proud. Instead, he prayed more often, kneeling before the Ark of the Covenant, asking God to keep his heart pure. "Let my eyes not be clouded by power," he prayed. "Let me always see truth through mercy." The people adored him. Under his rule, justice flowed like water, and peace began to settle over the land. The elders said, "God walks with this king." Mothers taught their children his sayings. Fathers told stories of the judgment that proved God's wisdom lived in a man. And somewhere, deep in the quiet chambers of his heart, Solomon understood something eternal, that the true test of wisdom is not how one rules, but how one loves. The sword he once called for had not been a weapon, it was a mirror, revealing the hearts of all who stood before it. And as the king laid down to rest that night, he realized that this moment of discernment and compassion was only the beginning, for even greater glory awaited him. A temple that would touch the heavens, a golden age where peace and prosperity would cover the earth like the morning dew. But for now, he closed his eyes with peace. The image of the childless mother still fresh in his mind, a reminder that divine wisdom always speaks through love. Part 5. Under Solomon's rule, Israel entered an era that historians and prophets alike would call the Golden Age. The kingdom stretched from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt, and peace reigned across the land. For the first time in generations, swords were beaten into plowshares. The air smelled of cedar and myrrh. The streets of Jerusalem bustled with traders from every corner of the known world. Solomon had turned wisdom into power, not through conquest, but through understanding. He knew the hearts of men and how to bind them not by force, but by vision. He built alliances with surrounding nations, established trade routes by sea, and raised cities that gleamed under the desert sun. His ships, constructed with Phoenician expertise, sailed to lands as distant as Ophir, returning with gold, silver, ivory, and exotic treasures that dazzled even the most seasoned merchants. But his greatest monument was the Temple of the Lord, a structure unlike anything the world had seen. It took 7 years to complete a house of pure devotion, built with the finest materials and adorned with gold from floor to ceiling. When the Ark of the Covenant was brought inside, a cloud of glory filled the temple so thick that the priests could not stand to minister. In that moment, Solomon knelt before the altar, his hands stretched toward heaven, and prayed, "O Lord, God of Israel, may your eyes be open toward this house, night and day. When your people pray toward this place, hear them from heaven here and forgive." The people of Israel wept and rejoiced. They saw in Solomon not only a king, but a bridge between heaven and earth. His words echoed through the temple courts like a prophecy fulfilled. As the kingdom flourished, tales of Solomon's brilliance began to spread beyond the borders of Israel. His name became legend, a man of immeasurable wealth and unmatched wisdom. Rulers from distant lands sent gifts to win his favor. But among all who came, one visitor would stand out above the rest: the Queen of Sheba. Sheba was a kingdom of mystery, rich, powerful, and far to the south, across deserts and seas. When the queen heard of Solomon's fame, she refused to believe it without seeing for herself. So she gathered a caravan of spices, gold, and precious stones, and journeyed north, her entourage stretching beyond the horizon. When she arrived in Jerusalem, she was greeted not with warlike pomp, but with grace. Solomon welcomed her as an equal, not an enemy. She tested him with riddles questions, designed to expose pride and weakness. Yet with each challenge, Solomon responded not with arrogance, but with gentle clarity. His answers pierced through the veil of mystery with truth so simple it felt divine. She watched his court, his servants, the order of his kingdom, the wisdom in his every decision. The queen, once skeptical, found herself in awe. She confessed to him, "What I had heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom was true, but I did not believe it until I came and saw with my own eyes. The half was not told to me." She praised the God of Israel and offered gifts beyond measure: 120 talents of gold, precious stones, and rare spices. Yet Solomon, true to his heart, gave her even more in return: gifts, wisdom, and the kind of understanding that left a mark on her soul. Their meeting was not merely political, it was symbolic. The world was drawn to the light of divine wisdom shining through Solomon. Nations sought peace rather than war. Leaders desired understanding more than domination. For a moment in time, the world seemed balanced between heaven and earth. But as the queen departed, taking with her the memory of a king who seemed touched by God himself, shadows began to gather on the edges of Solomon's golden light. The very gifts that elevated him, wealth, power, and desire, would soon become the seeds of his downfall. The story of Solomon was reaching its peak, but even the brightest sun must set. The test of wisdom was never in gaining it, it was in keeping it when the world offered everything. Part 6. Every story of greatness carries within it the whisper of its own undoing. For Solomon, That whisper came not as an enemy from afar, but as a quiet voice within the subtle pull of desire, the slow erosion of devotion. As years passed, the glory of his kingdom only grew. Gold flowed into Jerusalem until silver was counted as nothing. His palaces multiplied, gardens bloomed in the desert, and the sound of music echoed through the courtyards day and night. Solomon had everything a man could dream of: wealth, power, respect, and the love of his people. Yet, as the abundance increased, so did his appetite for more. He began to collect wives not merely for love, but for diplomacy. Each marriage sealed an alliance, secured peace, and expanded influence. Pharaoh's daughter was among the first, but soon came women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and countless other nations. In time, his household swelled with 700 wives and 300 concubines. What began as strategy became obsession. These women brought with them not only beauty, but beliefs gods made of stone, wood, and metal. And though Solomon once built the most magnificent temple to the one true God, his heart began to waver. The man who once knelt in humility before the Lord now built shrines on the hills of Jerusalem for idols, like Chemosh and Molech. The king who prayed for wisdom was now dividing his soul. In his old age, Solomon would walk through the gardens of these foreign gods, incense rising, voices chanting, drums echoing in the night. Somewhere deep within, he must have felt it, the silence of heaven. The connection that once guided every judgment, every word of counsel, had grown faint. The wisdom that once drew nations now trembled under the weight of compromise. The Lord, seeing Solomon's heart turn, spoke to him with sorrow rather than wrath. "Since you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your lifetime. Your son shall bear it." The word struck like thunder over calm water. For the first time, Solomon's crown felt heavy. His kingdom, built on divine favor, now stood on fragile ground. Enemies rose where peace once reigned. Rebellion simmered in the lands he had conquered. The unity of Israel began to fracture, and Solomon, once the wisest man who ever lived, found himself alone with the echo of his own choices. There are writings attributed to his later years. Ecclesiastes, in them we hear a voice not of pride, but of reflection. A man who had tasted every pleasure, conquered every challenge, and discovered the hollowness behind it all. He wrote, "I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a chasing after the wind." The king who had everything concluded that wisdom without obedience, knowledge without humility, was nothing. His final lesson was the one most never learn until the end, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of true wisdom. As Solomon neared death, the golden city he built shimmered in the fading light. Its walls still stood, its temples still glowed with glory, but its foundation had begun to crack. The son who would succeed him would inherit not only the throne, but a kingdom destined for division. And so, the story of the wisest man ends not in triumph, but in warning. Wisdom can build empires, heal hearts, and bring peace, but when it loses sight of its source, it becomes its own downfall. Solomon's life remains a paradox, both a hymn to divine insight and a lament of human weakness. His legacy whispers across the ages, "Guard your heart more than your crown, for what good is wisdom if it forgets the one who gave it?" And weet that the man once called the wisest king closed his eyes, leaving behind temples, treasures, and a timeless truth, that the greatest wisdom is not in knowing everything, but in staying faithful to the God who knows all.